The documentary frames the Kramer family murders as a case that looks obvious at first glance, then collapses under the weight of a perfect alibi, forcing investigators to confront a more unsettling reality. Darien, Illinois is introduced as a quiet suburb where violent crime feels anomalous, and the Kramers appear firmly embedded in that normalcy. Jeffrey Kramer, a towing company owner, and his wife Lori, an editor, are depicted as hard-working parents who build a stable home for their 3 adult children. By early March 2010, the household is temporarily reassembled under one roof. Angela is back home after a breakup. Anthony is staying in the basement. Michael, the youngest, is pursuing technical training and is described as optimistic and socially well-liked. That ordinary backdrop is important because it amplifies the shock of what happens next. In the early hours of March 2nd, a figure dressed in black doesn't creep in quietly or search for valuables. Instead, the intruder smashes a living room window with a hammer, a choice that reads less like burglary and more like decoration. Michael's girlfriend wakes, sees the intruder coming through the broken window, and escapes. Michael confronts the attacker and is shot repeatedly, then followed and finished with shot to the head. As gunfire echoes upstairs, Jeffrey and Lori rush toward the commotion, only to meet the shooter near the staircase. Jeffrey is shot near the front entry. Lori is shot on the stairs. The documentary emphasizes execution-style wounds, close range, and speed, portraying a massacre completed in minutes with no theft, no ransacking, and no attempt to simulate a robbery beyond the forced entry. Angela hears the sequence and hides in a closet, whispering to 911 that shots are being fired inside the house. Anthony escapes from the basement through a window and is found outside when police arrive. The scene investigators encounter is described as chaotic and clinical at once. Shell casings, blood, and bodies positioned where family members tried to respond. The key interpretive leap is that the crime is personal and targeted, not opportunistic. When detectives ask Angela who want to harm them, she immediately names her ex-boyfriend, Johnny Borisov, describing him as controlling, volatile, and hostile toward her family. The documentary supports this suspicion with alleged prior incidents, escalating conflict, and the intensity of a custody battle. But then it introduces the central complication. The obvious suspect is captured on casino surveillance during the window of the murders, seemingly without any gap that would allow him to leave, travel, kill, and return unnoticed. That hard alibi doesn't end the narrative. It redirects it. Investigators pivot from the question, did he do it, to how could it have made it happen anyway, and begin looking for intermediaries, burner phones, and a second actor capable of doing the killing while the instigator remains visibly elsewhere. The documentary shifts from the shock of the crime itself to the mechanics of deception and manipulation that allowed it to happen. With Johnny Borisov ruled out as a shooter due to his airtight casino alibi, investigators are forced to widen their lens. The question is no longer whether Angela's ex-boyfriend was dangerous or angry, but whether he could have orchestrated violence indirectly. This reframing is crucial because it moves the case away from a simple who pulled the trigger narrative and toward a more complex examination of control, influence, and psychological coercion. Detectives begin examining phone records, text messages, and patterns of communication around the time of the murders. It is here that the investigation uncovers the first real crack in the alibi's apparent perfection, a series of calls from an unregistered burner phone placed to Borisov after murders. The calls themselves are suspicious, but what truly changes the direction of the case is the voicemail. The voice is young, male frantic, and clearly unstable. At one point, the caller identifies himself as Jake. That single detail opens a door the investigators had not yet considered. The documentary then introduces Jacob Nodars, a 23-year-old whose life, by his own later account, was unraveling long before March 2010. Raised in a rigid and abusive household, he struggled with depression from childhood and drifted into substance abuse in his teens. By his early 20s, Jacob had no stable career, no strong emotional anchors, and a deep sense of isolation. In true crime terms, he fits a familiar but unsettling profile. Someone psychologically fragile, desperate for belonging, and highly susceptible to influence. The film carefully links Jacob to the Kramer family through Michael Kramer, framing their fractured friendship as a critical emotional trigger. Michael's decision to cut Jacob off after learning about his association with Johnny is portrayed as another abandonment in a life already defined by rejection. When Johnny re-enters Jacob's world, he does not do so as a distant criminal figure, but as someone who offers attention, validation, and a distorted sense of purpose. According to the documentary, Johnny exploits this vulnerability methodically. He presents himself not as a petty drug dealer, but as a connected figure within a powerful criminal organization. He tells stories of gangs, hierarchy, and violent enforcement, reinforcing the illusion that he is merely a small part of something much larger and far more dangerous. The manipulation escalates when Johnny claims that Angela and the Kramer family are liabilities who know too much, and that orders have come down to eliminate them. Crucially, Johnny frames the situation as unavoidable. If Jacob refuses, the organization will turn on him and his family instead. The documentary emphasizes that this is not a sudden demand, but a gradual construction of fear, obligation, and inevitability. By the time Johnny lays out the plan, Jacob believes he is choosing between two catastrophes, and that compliance is the only path that might spare his own family. The plan itself is disturbingly precise. Johnny allegedly instructs Jacob to break a window with a hammer, use a firearm to kill everyone inside, and make the attack resemble a gang hit. At the same time, Johnny positions himself at the casino, confident that surveillance footage will shield him from suspicion. This division of labor, one man creating distance and deniability, while the other commits the violence, becomes the moral core of Part 2. The documentary is explicit in showing how Johnny's alibi is not evidence of innocence, but part of the architecture of the crime. Jacob follows the instructions, purchases a .40 caliber handgun days before the murders, and carries out the attack in the early hours of March 2nd. After the killings, the psychological collapse begins almost immediately. Jacob flees the scene, driving toward Florida, increasingly paranoid that he is being followed either by police or by the fictitious gang Johnny described. His fear is so intense that he calls 911 himself, reporting that he believes someone is after him. When police eventually locate him asleep in his car near his parent home, the documentary portrays him as emotionally spent and terrified rather than calculating. During interrogation, Jacob breaks down and confesses, repeatedly expressing fear that speaking the truth will lead to retaliation against his family. This confession reframes a massacre not as an act of pure malice by the shooter, but as the end result of sustained psychological pressure applied by a more calculating instigator. The documentary turns from confession to consequence, examining how the justice system translates manipulation and violence into legal responsibility. With Jacob Nodars in custody and openly admitting that he pulled the trigger, the case might appear on the surface to be resolved. Yet the film makes clear that for investigators and prosecutors, Jacob's confession is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a more difficult task. The central challenge becomes proving that Johnny Borzov, who never entered the Kramer home and never fired a weapon, bears equal or greater responsibility for the deaths of Jeffrey, Lori, and Michael Kramer. This is where the narrative shifts from psychology to law, from fear and influence to evidence, intent, and causation. The documentary carefully explains how prosecutors construct their case against Johnny not around physical presence, but around orchestration. Jacob's detailed confession provides an initial framework. He recounts how Johnny planted the idea of a powerful gang, how he framed the murders as an unavoidable order, and how he supplied both the plan and the emotional pressure to carry it out. But confession alone is never enough. The film emphasizes that prosecutors must corroborate Jacob's story with independent evidence to avoid the defense's most obvious counterargument, that Jacob is mentally unstable and inventing a mastermind to lessen his own guilt. To address this, investigators lean heavily on digital footprints. Phone records show repeated contact between Johnny and the burner phone linked to Jacob before and after murders. Jailhouse recordings captured Johnny continuing to exert control, warning Jacob about consequences, reinforcing the idea of unseen forces, and subtly coaching him on what to say and what not to say. These recordings become especially powerful because they demonstrate that the manipulation did not end once the crime was committed. It persisted even after both men were behind bars. The documentary underscores how this evidence reframes Johnny's casino alibi. What initially seemed like proof of innocence is reinterpreted as strategic positioning. Prosecutors argue that Johnny deliberately placed himself in a location saturated with surveillance cameras to ensure that no one could place him near the crime scene. The alibi, rather than exonerating him, becomes circumstantial proof of premeditation. This inversion is one of the most compelling aspects of the case because it challenges a deeply ingrained assumption about criminal responsibility. The film suggests that modern crimes, especially those involving coercion and coordination, cannot be understood solely through physical proximity. In this framework, intent, planning, and control carry as much weight as the act itself. As the case moves toward trial, the documentary devotes significant attention to Jacob Nodars's plea deal. He pleads guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and receives a 75-year sentence in exchange for cooperation. This decision is presented as morally uncomfortable but legally pragmatic. Jacob is undeniably responsible for the killings, yet his cooperation is essential to holding Johnny accountable. The film does not attempt to absolve Jacob. Instead, it situates him in a gray zone between perpetrator and manipulated instrument. His testimony is portrayed as emotionally raw and self-incriminating, filled with fear, shame, and a persistent belief that he was acting under threat. The prosecution's task is to show that while Jacob made the choice to kill, that choice was engineered by Johnny through sustained psychological pressure. Johnny's trial becomes the emotional and narrative climax of the Kramer case. The defense strategy, as described in the documentary, is straightforward and aggressive. They portray Jacob as a deeply disturbed individual who acted alone, motivated by personal grievances and mental instability. Johnny, in this version of events, is cast as a convenient scapegoat, blamed by a murderer looking to share or deflect responsibility. The documentary contrasts this narrative with the prosecution's methodical presentation of evidence. Jurors hear the recorded jailhouse conversations. They see timelines of phone calls. They listen to Angela Kramer describe her fear of Johnny and his history of aggression. Most importantly, they hear Jacob recount the manipulation in detail, not as an abstract claim, but as a sequence of specific conversations, instructions, and threats. The film emphasizes how quickly the jury reaches its verdict. After deliberating for less than a day, they find Johnny guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. The speed of the decision is framed as a reflection of how cohesive and convincing the evidence is, rather than a rush to judgment. During sentencing, the judge delivers words that the documentary treats as a moral summation of the case. By orchestrating the murders from a distance, Johnny is said to have inflicted terror and destruction without ever facing the immediate risk his victims faced. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole is presented not only as punishment, but as a statement about accountability in crimes of manipulation. In its closing reflections on the Kramer case, Part 3 widens a lens beyond this single tragedy. The documentary suggests that the most disturbing aspect of the crime is not just the brutality of the killings, but how easily psychological coercion can be weaponized. Johnny does not appear as a stereotypical mastermind or criminal genius. Instead, he is portrayed as someone who understands people, especially their fears and insecurities, and uses that understanding to devastating effect. The film implicitly asks viewers to reconsider how society defines agency and blame. When one person creates the conditions that make violence feel inevitable to another, where does responsibility truly lie? The documentary deliberately widens its scope, transitioning from the Kramer case to a second, far more expansive narrative in order to explore a darker and more ideological form of family annihilation. The shift is jarring by design. Where the Kramer murders were driven by personal obsession, manipulation, and proximity to domestic life, the Mueller family case is presented as a collision between criminal greed and extremist belief. By placing these two stories side by side, the film invites a viewer to see patterns that transcend individual motives, showing how entire families can be erased either through intimate betrayal or through abstract hatred fueled by ideology. The Mueller family, living in rural Arkansas in the mid-1990s, is introduced as insular but tightly bonded. William and Nancy Mueller homeschool their 8-year-old daughter, Sarah, and structure their lives around gun shows, firearms collecting, and small-scale business. The documentary is careful not to sensationalize this lifestyle at first. Instead, it frames it as routine within their community emphasizing trust, self-reliance, and family unity. This sense of normalcy is crucial because it mirrors the setup of the Kramer story while leading to a very different outcome. In January 1996, the Muellers disappear without a trace. There's no frantic 911 call, no surviving witness, no immediate crime scene. Time itself becomes a weapon. Weeks pass before concern turns into alarm, and months pass before the truth begins to surface. The documentary stresses how silence and delay complicate justice, allowing perpetrators to scatter evidence and distance themselves emotionally and geographically from their actions. As the investigation unfolds, the film reveals the brutality of what happened after the Muellers were ambushed by men posing as federal agents. Unlike the rapid execution in the Kramer home, the Mueller murders are prolonged and sadistic. The parents are interrogated, tortured, and forced to watch their daughter suffer. The use of stun guns, plastic bags, duct tape, and weighted bodies marks a calculated effort not only to kill, but to dominate and humiliate. The documentary does not linger gratuitously on these details, but it makes clear that this was violence meant to assert power. When the bodies are eventually recovered from a bayou months later, the method of disposal underscores a chilling intent to erase the family completely, to leave nothing behind but unanswered questions. The narrative then pivots to the perpetrators, revealing how ideology transforms cruelty into purpose. Chavai Kehoe and Daniel Lewis Lee are portrayed not as impulsive criminals, but as products of radicalization. Raised in environments steeped in white supremacist and anti-government beliefs, they view the world through a lens of grievance and entitlement. The film traces how these beliefs evolve from abstract hatred into concrete action. Robbery becomes justified as redistribution. Murder becomes framed as necessary, even righteous. The Muellers are not seen as individuals, but as resources, obstacles, or symbols of a system the perpetrators despise. This ideological framing distinguishes the Mueller case from the Kramer murders. Johnny Borisov manipulates one vulnerable individual to serve a personal vendetta. Kehoe and Lee act within a worldview that normalizes violence as a means of reshaping society. Part 4 places particular emphasis on the role of escalation. The documentary shows that the Mueller murders were not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of criminal behavior tied to extremist networks. The stolen weapons, fake law enforcement gear, and bomb-making materials discovered later suggest preparation for future acts of violence. In this sense, the family's murder is both an end and a beginning. It satisfies immediate goals of theft and revenge, while reinforcing the perpetrator's belief in their own power. The film draws a subtle but unsettling parallel to the Kramer case here. In both stories, violence reinforces the perpetrator's self-image. Johnny's success in controlling Jacob validates his sense of dominance. Kehoe's ability to kill and evade capture strengthens his ideological delusions. The legal outcomes of the Mueller case introduce another layer of moral tension. Daniel Lewis Lee is sentenced to death and executed decades later, while Kehoe receives life imprisonment. The documentary does not argue explicitly for or against the death penalty, but highlights the asymmetry of punishment and the discomfort it creates. Lee, portrayed as volatile and violent, but not necessarily the sole architect of the crime, pays the ultimate price. Kehoe, widely described as the ideological driver, survives. This imbalance echoes earlier discomfort around Jacob Nodars's plea deal. Across both cases, the justice system is shown making compromises in pursuit of accountability, often leaving observers uneasy about whether punishment truly aligns with culpability. As Part 4 nears its conclusion, the documentary pulls back to examine the broader implications of these two stories taken together. It suggests that modern mass violence against families often emerges from one of two pathways. The first is intimate manipulation, where personal relationships and psychological vulnerabilities are exploited to lethal effect. The second is ideological radicalization, where abstract belief systems strip victims of their humanity. In both pathways, the killers do not see themselves as villains. Johnny frames himself as a wrong father. Kehoe frames himself as a revolutionary. The film argues that this self-justification is what makes such crimes especially dangerous, because it allows perpetrators to rationalize escalating harm without confronting the moral reality of their actions. The final moments of Part 4 are reflective rather than procedural. The documentary asks the viewer to consider why family annihilation resonates so deeply in public consciousness. Families represent safety, continuity, and identity. When they're destroyed, it feels like an attack on the idea of normal life itself. By juxtaposing the Kramer and Mueller cases, the film suggests that the threat does not come from a single source. It can arise from personal obsession or from collective hatred, from whispered threats in private conversations, or from loud ideologies broadcast to the world. The common thread is dehumanization, the moment when victims stop being seen as people and start being seen as means to an end. The documentary moves into its most reflective and unsettling territory, using the Kramer and Mueller cases not as endpoints, but as lenses through which to examine how extreme violence against families is enabled, misunderstood, and sometimes inadvertently normalized. This final section is less about recounting events and more about confronting patterns. The film asks the viewer to step back from individual villains and consider the system's beliefs and blind spots that allow such crimes to take shape long before the first shot is fired or the first door is forced open. One of the central ideas in Part 5 is that family annihilation rarely emerges from a single moment of madness. Instead, it grows gradually through warning signs that are either minimized, misread, or rationalized away. In the Kramer case, Johnny Borisov's controlling behavior, violent outbursts, and fixation on Angela were not secrets. They were visible, disruptive, and repeatedly described as issues, yet they never fully crossed the threshold that might have triggered decisive intervention. The documentary suggests that society often struggles to categorize people like Johnny. He is not a stranger, not a mass intruder, not a caricature of evil. He is a former partner, a parent, someone embedded in everyday life. This familiarity creates hesitation. The film argues that when violence is framed as a personal matter or a domestic dispute, it becomes easier to underestimate its potential for escalation. In contrast, the Mueller case highlights a different failure of recognition. Here, the warning signs are ideological rather than interpersonal. Chevy Kehoe and Daniel Lewis Lee did not hide their beliefs. Their racism, anti-government rhetoric, and obsession with weapons were well known within certain circles. Yet, these signals were often dismissed as fringe extremism, more rhetoric than reality. Part 5 emphasizes that ideology can function as a slow-burning accelerant. It reshapes moral boundaries over time, turning theft into entitlement and murder into necessity. By the time violence occurs, it no longer feels like a transgression to the perpetrator, but like the logical conclusion of a belief system that has gone unchallenged. The documentary then turns its attention to the concept of agency, complicating the idea of choice without absolving responsibility. Jacob Nodars's role forces viewers to confront an uncomfortable truth. A person can be both a victim of manipulation and a perpetrator of horrific violence. Part 5 resists the temptation to simplify this duality. It does not portray Jacob as innocent, nor does it reduce him to a monster. Instead, it examines how fear, dependency, and psychological pressure can narrow a person's perceived options until violence feels inevitable. The film is careful to stress that understanding this process is not about excusing behavior, but about recognizing how easily coercion can be weaponized when vulnerabilities go unaddressed. Another major theme in Part 5 is the role of narrative, both within the crimes themselves and in how they are later consumed by the public. Johnny's fabricated story of a powerful drug organization and Kehoe's mythologized vision of a white supremacist future both function as narratives designed to give meaning to violence. These stories are seductive because they offer clarity, purpose, and identity to people who feel lost or powerless. The documentary suggests that true crime media must be cautious not to replicate this dynamic. By focusing too heavily on perpetrators' backstories or ideologies without sufficient context, storytelling risks amplifying the very myths that fuel violence. Part 5 positions responsible storytelling as an act of resistance, one that centers victims, exposes manipulation, and refuses to glamorize control or extremism. The justice system itself is placed under quiet scrutiny. The film does not accuse courts or law enforcement of failure, but highlights the inherent limitations of legal outcomes. Life sentences, death penalties, and plea deals can impose consequences, but they cannot restore what was taken or fully resolve moral unease. The disparity between sentences in both cases leaves lingering questions about proportionality and fairness. Why does one person die for a crime while another, arguably more influential, lives? Why does someone who pulls the trigger receive a finite sentence while the architect of violence disappears into life imprisonment? Part 5 does not offer answers. Instead, it frames these questions as necessary discomforts, reminders that justice is a human system attempting to measure harm that is ultimately immeasurable. As the documentary approaches its conclusion, it shifts from diagnosis to implication. If these crimes are not isolated anomalies, then prevention must extend beyond reactive policing. The film suggests that intervention begins with recognizing patterns of control, coercion, and radicalization early, before they crystallize into action. This includes taking domestic threats seriously, investing in mental health support for isolated individuals, and confronting extremist ideologies before they metastasize into violence. The documentary is careful not to present prevention as simple or guaranteed. Instead, it frames it as an ongoing, imperfect effort that requires attention, courage, and a willingness to name uncomfortable truths. The final moments of Part 5 return to the human cost. The Kramer and Mueller families are not symbols or case studies. They are people whose lives ended in terror, and whose absence reshaped the lives of those left behind. The documentary avoids sentimental closure, choosing instead to honor the victims by refusing to reduce their deaths to entertainment. It leaves the audience with a sober awareness that family annihilation is not just a crime category, but a rupture in the social fabric. When families are destroyed, trust erodes, and the assumption of safety within private spaces is permanently shaken. The documentary steps away from narrative reconstruction and enters a more analytical, almost philosophical space, asking what these cases ultimately reveal about violence, responsibility, and the limits prevention. After tracing the intimate manipulation in the Kramer murders and the ideological extremism behind the Mueller killings, the film no longer treats these events as isolated horrors. Instead, it frames them as expressions of deeper structural and psychological forces that modern societies are still struggling to understand and contain. One of the central reflections in Part 6 is the fragility of trust. Both families lived in environments that, on the surface, promised safety and predictability. The Kramers resided in a quiet suburb defined by routine and familiarity. The Muellers lived in a rural community where self-reliance and neighborly distance were taken as forms of security. In both cases, danger did not come from an unknown intruder motivated by random cruelty. It came from individuals who had already crossed a boundary of trust, either through personal relationships or through shared ideological spaces. The documentary argues that this is what makes family-centered violence so destabilizing. It attacks the assumption that home is a sanctuary and that those allowed close are inherently safe. Part 6 also revisits the concept of power, emphasizing that violence is often less about rage than about control. Johnny Borzov never needed to be present at the Kramer home because his power operated remotely through fear, obligation, and manufactured inevitability. Chevy Keogh's violence was similarly rooted in domination, though expressed through ideology rather than intimacy. For him, control meant redefining the moral universe so that murder became permissible, even necessary. The film suggests that when power is exercised in these ways, physical violence becomes almost secondary. The real damage occurs earlier, when one person successfully reshapes another's perception of reality, convincing them that harm is justified or unavoidable. The documentary then turns to the uncomfortable question of responsibility in such contexts. Part 6 rejects simplistic binaries of victim and villain. Jacob Nodars's role continues to trouble easy moral categorization. He is both the man who killed and a man who was systematically terrorized into believing he had no alternative. The film does not absolve him, but uses his story to challenge viewers to think more carefully about how responsibility is assigned. If coercion can narrow choice until violence feels like survival, then accountability must be understood alongside vulnerability. This perspective does not weaken the case for punishment, the documentary argues. Instead, it strengthens a case for earlier intervention before coercion reaches the point of irreversibility. Another key focus of Part 6 is the role of institutions in recognizing emerging threats. The documentary notes that warning signs existed in both cases, but they appeared in forms that are often dismissed. Domestic abuse complaints, controlling behavior, extremist rhetoric, and obsession with weapons are frequently treated as background noise rather than red flags. The film argues that institutions are often better equipped to respond to completed crimes than to prevent them, because prevention requires judgment under uncertainty. Acting too early risks overreach. Acting too late results in tragedy. Part 6 does not offer policy prescriptions, but it highlights this tension as one of the defining challenges of modern criminal justice and social services. The documentary also reflects on the role of spectatorship. True crime as a genre invites audiences to analyze, speculate, and judge. Part 6 asks whether this engagement can be transformed from consumption into awareness. By understanding how manipulation and radicalization function, viewers may become more attentive to similar patterns in their own communities. The film is careful not to claim that knowledge alone prevents violence. However, it suggests that narratives which focus on process rather than spectacle can at least shift attention toward early warning signs instead of post-crime fascination. The documentary closes by returning to the human meaning of the stories it is told, resisting any sense of finality or moral certainty. After tracing manipulation, ideology, and systemic failure, the film deliberately avoids offering a comforting conclusion. Instead, it reframes the Kramer and Mueller cases as warnings rather than lessons learned, emphasizing that the forces which produce these crimes are still present and unresolved. The final section underscores how easily violence can hide in plain sight. In both cases, the perpetrators did not appear as obvious monsters. Johnny Borzov was a familiar figure, a former partner and father whose behavior, while troubling, was often categorized as personal dysfunction rather than imminent danger. Chevy Keogh and Daniel Lewis Lee openly embraced extremist beliefs, yet their rhetoric was dismissed for years as fringe noise rather than a credible threat. Part 7 argues that society tends to wait for violence to confirm its own seriousness, only recognizing danger once the cost is irreversible. This delay, the documentary suggests, is not rooted in ignorance but in discomfort. Acknowledging potential for extreme harm forces communities to confront conflict, ideology, and control before they escalate beyond words. The documentary then turns inward, asking what responsibility rests with the viewer. True crime often invites judgment from a safe distance, encouraging audiences to identify villains and reassure themselves that such horrors exist elsewhere. Part 7 challenges this impulse. By showing how violence grows out of everyday relationships and widely circulating beliefs, the film suggests that these crimes are not anomalies but distortions of familiar dynamics. Control masquerading as concern, ideology disguised as identity, fear framed as loyalty. Recognizing these patterns does not guarantee prevention, but failing to recognize them almost guarantees repetition. In its closing moments, the documentary honors the victims by refusing to define them solely by their deaths. The Kramer and Mueller families are remembered as people who lived ordinary lives, built routines, and trusted the spaces and relationships around them. Their destruction is presented not as spectacle, but as loss. The film avoids sentimental imagery or triumphant narration, choosing restraint as a form of respect. The absence left behind, it implies, is itself the most truthful testament to what was taken.